Hello, everyone. My name is Sherwin. I'm the pastor of Laketon Bethel, and it's good to have you with us today. What I'm doing today is making a video here at Hot Rod Harley in Muskegon, where my son works. I'm going to be on vacation this week, and I wanted to make a video that could be played at Laketon Bethel on Sunday morning. So this is it. Hot Rod Harley is a great place to visit, and I always have fun here. What I want to show you is this little bike. This is one that I've told my son that I want for my birthday. This is a Harley, I believe it's called a Tri-Glide, or no, it's a Road Glide 3. And it's a really nice bike. I don't know if you can see it all that well. I just want to show it to you. But I'm telling them they ought to get me that for my birthday. But that hasn't happened just yet. So, eventually it will, because I just figure I'm one day closer to buying one of these. But I've never done one of these talks from the seat of a Harley before. So today I'm going to do that. And hopefully you all can see me and hear me okay. What I wanted to talk about was how people are rejected from churches, which is a common thing, and it has to stop. I want this stopped. You can see from the opening slide here that I have a poster of a show called Big Love, and this show takes place in Salt Lake City, and it's about a man who has 3 wives. He's Mormon, he's in a polygamous relationship, and I'm just wondering how he would be accepted in one of our churches today, being that he's in this polygamous relationship. I wonder how I would be accepted if I showed up on this Tri-Glide wearing a flannel shirt, and my hair is a mess, my beard, etc. I wonder if I'd be accepted. I know I wouldn't have been accepted 40 years ago in most churches. And, I lived through the 70s when a bunch of hippies decided that they found Jesus, and they started going to churches, particularly in Southern California. And what happened to them is they were rejected. The churches didn't want them in there. They had a dress code, you had to have a coat and tie on. They had a hair code, and there was constant conflicts with the World War II generation. Hippies would come in wearing hats. You can't wear a hat in church. And they would do all kinds of other things. The hippies would walk across the church lawns instead of using the sidewalks. And folks would yell at them for that. They would say, "Get your hair cut and then come back." And stop listening to that nasty rock and roll, because we all know that's evil. But better yet, they would say to the hippies, better yet, just stay away. We don't really want you here. And that, folks, is wrong on so many levels. But that's how it was. I had a teacher who taught the history of Christianity. It's a fascinating class. I'd recommend it to anybody. But he said, one thing you need to understand in the history of the church is that all churches are run by humans. And as humans, we all make mistakes. You got to keep that in mind. And he said that Christianity is at its best, at its absolute best, when we err on the side of grace, when we are merciful to people who need it. And remember always that people are more important than rules. We need to see that. Now, we know that every organization has its rules. When I was a delivery man for UPS in the 70s, it was kind of interesting. We were not allowed to wear our pants home. Now, we could wear the brown shirts home, but we had to leave our pants at work, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing. And I asked, well, why in the world do you have to do that? And UPS said that they didn't want their drivers wearing uniforms in bars. So that's why we had to leave our pants at work. Now, this meant, of course, you had to change your clothes in a locker room, And there's always some guys who would come in their boxers because they said, well, we can't wear pants when we leave here. So that was kind of comical too. And these guys would get in trouble for not wearing the pants to work until they picked up their uniform pants. But the Teamsters Union actually backed them and said, no, there's nothing in the contract that says you have to wear pants to work. So the union backed it. Now, churches, some of them have more rules than others. Some churches that I've heard of require the members of the board and the staff to allow an independent outfit to look at their browsing history online. They actually have a browsing history viewing for board members. And when one of my sons lived in Salt Lake City, he became friends with several of the Mormon people that he worked with and got to know socially. And they said that, the Mormon church requires that you give 10% of your gross to the church. And if they suspect that you're not doing that, they will ask to see your tax returns. And if you're not giving 10%, you are disciplined and probably shunned or excommunicated, whatever they call it. And they have different rules for different times. Now, today I know that I can walk into any worship service in most Reformed churches wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and it's not going to be a problem. 50 years ago, that would have definitely been a problem. Today, we have different kinds of rules. Like today, for instance, smokers are almost banned from most churches. If you smoke cigarettes, you are out of luck. There might be a designated smoking area in a remote corner of the parking lot, but that'd be about it. Smokers are the new pariahs of the church. And then there was this thing a few years ago with COVID masks. There were people who avoided people who didn't have the mask, and people who didn't want to wear the mask thought very poorly of the people who actually wore the masks. So that was kind of how it works. What Jesus is teaching us is quite simple. We have to err on the side of grace whenever we make these kind of calls. Always remember that people are more important than rules. Now, Jesus classified people in basically three categories. As the slide shows, there's sheep, which are the normal people. Then there's wolves, who are the people who prey on the sheep, who want to eat the sheep, who want to consume them, want to make themselves wealthy off the sheep. And then there are the shepherds, whose job it is to warn and protect the sheep. Now, in our culture, in our society, of course, the wolves are always hungry. They're always looking for more sheep to devour. And they do find them. They find them all over the place. So we have to watch out for the wolves. And in a free society like ours, there's lots of wolves. And wolves do come into churches. We can't keep them out. They come in and they want to dominate. They want to control because they like power. People who have no power elsewhere come into churches to find power and feel significant. It's a lesson I've had to learn over and over again. Unfortunately, this was already happening with the first generation of Christians. Today I'm going to read you a story from the New Testament, from the Bible, Acts chapter 15. It's kind of an interesting story. It talks about Paul and Barnabas. They were missionaries, and they ran into problems because in the churches that they were establishing, they allowed Harley riders in. They allowed, not literally, because Harley wasn't invented yet, of course, but they allowed people in that looked scary to some others. They were allowing non-Jewish people into the church, which at that time was made up primarily of Jewish people. So this is how the narrative goes. It's a few paragraphs, and I'll stop between the paragraphs and explain them. First one says, while Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch of Syria, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers. Unless you are circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. Well, that might drive some away. You want to do what? You want to circumcise? And remember, in those days, there's no anesthesia. But they were saying that you had to become a Jew first before you could become a Christian. Well, I know what I would have said. I would have said, yeah, right. Forget this. It's not happening. I'm not going to go through that. Well, the story goes on. It says that Paul and Barnabas, to their credit, they were both Jewish people, but they disagreed with these folks. It says Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. Finally, the church decided to send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, accompanied by some local believers, to talk to the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent the delegates to Jerusalem, and they stopped along the way in Phoenicia and Samaria to visit the believers. They told them, much to everyone's joy, that the Gentiles too were being converted. See, Jerusalem was the informal headquarters of that first generation church. It says here, much to everyone's joy, the non-Jewish people were coming in. That's a good thing. Now, the pagans that were in that area, they lived in the fear of the gods. They had to make sacrifices. They had to do things that, well, they just didn't like doing. They had to sacrifice animals to keep the gods from being angry with them. And then they heard a word of a God who sacrifices for them. They heard of Jesus who sacrificed for them. And the Jews weren't all that different, than the pagans. They lived in constant fear of God. But then they were converted to the grace of Jesus. Jesus said to them, trust me to save you. That's all you have to do. And that brought great joy for everyone. It was a relief. Now the narrative goes on like this. When they arrived in Jerusalem, Barnabas and Paul were welcomed by the whole church, including the apostles and elders. They reported everything that God had done through them. But then some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and insisted the Gentile converts must be circumcised and required to follow the law of Moses. At this point, the wolves were showing their teeth. Now, Paul and Barnabas were welcomed by the whole church, as were these non-Jewish people. They were welcomed by the whole church except for the Pharisees, who said, you need to follow our rules. You need to submit to circumcision. You need to eat only kosher food. And you need to observe the Sabbath, etc. It's kind of like some churches today that say you're not allowed to have alcohol or caffeine. I would like to start a new rule too. How about we had a rule, you're not allowed to eat lettuce or broccoli, just because I don't care for those two things. Maybe that'd be a good rule to have. That wouldn't. So the narrative goes on like this. It says, so the apostles and elders met together to resolve this issue. At the meeting, after a long discussion, Peter stood and addressed them as follows. Brothers, you all know that God chose me from among you some time ago to preach to the Gentiles so they could hear the good news and believe. God knows people's hearts, and he confirmed that he accepts Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. Now, you all remember the story from last week about Peter and Cornelius, how Peter went to this Roman captain who was a big shot in the army that had taken over Israel, that was dominating that part of the world, the Roman army. And he went to him and talked to him. He's not allowed to do that by Jewish law, but God sent a messenger to him to say it was okay, so he did it. Peter chose to bring the good news of Jesus to non-Jews. And they believed. And they were given the Holy Spirit. And that doesn't mean they were foaming at the mouth and falling down on stage and that sort of thing. But it was a quiet filling of love. They saw the fruits of the Spirit in them of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That list is all in the New Testament in the book of Galatians, chapter 5. So that's kind of how that all held together. Now, the narrative goes on where Peter says this: He, meaning God, made no distinction between us and them, for he cleansed their hearts through faith. Now, God can cleanse any heart. He can change any heart. All we have to do is be open to it. It is the mission of Jesus to bring heathens into heaven. And it must be our mission too. All are welcome. So the narrative goes on, says this, where Peter says, so why are you now challenging God by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear? We believe that we are all saved the same way, by the undeserved grace of Jesus. So the Jews, admit they could never keep all those laws. There's 613 of them. They really weren't laws of Moses. They were add-ons, but the people thought they were laws of Moses. Along comes these guys who says, you don't have to do that. You can't do it anyway. You are saved by the undeserved grace of Jesus. Even the Old Testament prophets, denounced this kind of legalism, right in the context of who they were there. The prophet Micah says this, and lots of folks know this. He says, no, people, the Lord has told you what is good. And this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I'm sitting here in this store. My oldest son works here, and that's why he graciously allowed me to do this, just so I'd have a little different background. But, my oldest son's name is John, and our youngest daughter is Jamie. Now, John had a lot more rules to follow than Jamie did because we were inexperienced parents. John was our first teenager, and all parents know the trauma that goes along with that. Well, in this case, the Pharisees were the oldest kids, and they didn't want the newbies to get by with not following the rules. Our older kids are amazed at how much the younger ones could get by with, because we learned as parents, some rules just can't be followed. But the Pharisees here did not want to err on the side of grace. Now, if you're going to err, and we all do, let's make sure we err on the side of grace, because the souls that we bring to Christ are worth it. The college I went to required wearing neckties. It was bizarre. A farm boy from Iowa can't go to class wearing a necktie, but I had to do it. But, I found a loophole. I'd put a bib overall on, and then I'd just clip a necktie to the bib, and that followed the dress code, and it worked. Now, I've always resented wearing ties, and I've worn them most of my life. But then I turned 65, and I said, you know what? The neckties are going. I'm not ever going to wear one again. The only exception being if our youngest daughter gets married and she asks me to wear one to her wedding. Then I might wear one. Otherwise, I'm not putting on a tie again, ever. That's the way the church has to be too. No dress codes in church, ever. We are not called to make people follow rules. We're called to love and to serve. People can't be saved by merit. They're only saved by mercy. The merit system says, well, you've got to do so much good to balance out for the bad that you've done in your lifetime. There's 2 columns, and if the bad one is longer than the good one, you're in trouble. You're going to go straight to hell, all that sort of thing. That is malarkey. It doesn't matter how many demerits you have. Your salvation is not in jeopardy. Under the merit system, it would be, but we're not under that. We're under the mercy system. Jesus bought your salvation. So then trust him to give it to you. Sometimes people think they need rules to prove that they're better than you. I hung out with a pastor who was a missionary before he became a pastor. Somewhere, some remote tribe in South America, where these people worshiped pagan gods. They had a bunch of them they worshiped, and these gods required sacrifices to give them prosperity and health and all that. These gods required tattoos and scarring and polygamy. The practice of having more than one wife was common. Now, these people were told about Jesus, and the majority of them converted. They said, "We like this God who sacrifices for us." But then a problem came up for the missionaries. The tribal chief, who now trusted Jesus to save him, the tribal chief, who was now a Christian, had 3 wives. And the supporters of the mission back in the United States found out about this, and they didn't like it. It wasn't long before the funding for that mission dried up, and the missionaries were recalled. That's why this guy was a fellow pastor of another denomination in South Dakota. That's where I met him. They stopped funding the mission because they practiced polygamy. And this guy was recalled, and I don't know the rest of the story. But these people did not err on the side of grace. Grace would have overlooked the polygamy, but that denomination wouldn't do it. They said polygamy is illegal in the United States, therefore it should be illegal in the rainforests of South America, in a completely different cultural context. And they stopped trying to get these people to know Jesus. I would have said, get them to trust Jesus to save them, and don't worry about how many wives they have. Get the wives to trust Jesus too. Always err on the side of grace. Now, if you look at this next slide, I have to ask you the question if you've ever heard of religious OCPD. Now, OCPD is a new one for me. I didn't even know it existed, but the psychological community changes definitions quite frequently on different things. But OCPD is an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, is a mental health condition that causes people to be preoccupied with order, rules, and control. People with OCPD may have rigid beliefs and ways of doing things, and they may have difficulty compromising with others. Now, religious OCPD is fairly common. Organized religion is famous for it. It is sometimes preoccupied with order and rules and control. I think it'd be a worthwhile task for this church, for anyone listening to me, to make a point of curing religious OCPD. Churches all over have a reputation for it. If we're going to err, let's err on the side of grace. And let's be known as a people of grace. Now, there's several customers in this store right now, so I was going to start this puppy up as a benediction, just to say goodbye to you, but it's quite noisy, and I think we're just going to forego that. So I hope you enjoyed the background that you see here of Muskegon, Michigan, Hot Rod Harley, and my thanks to the Hot Rod Harley folks for letting me do this here. It was fun. And that's all I have to say about that. Tune in next week or come visit us. We have services at 9 and 11 every Sunday. And we hope to see you there. Thanks. Well, I'm a little stiff getting off of this thing. I was told I don't have arthritis. I have early onset rigor mortis. So again, friends, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. As always, thanks again for joining us. We have 2 services on Sunday morning, and if you're in town, we'd invite you to come. One's at 9 o'clock and one's at 11 o'clock. And if you wish to support Laketon Bethel, you can go to laketonbethel.org and follow the steps there on our website. Or you can just look at this QR code, scan it in with your phone, and you can give through Secure Give, and all your gifts will go directly into our account. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.